Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In the last part, that is part 5 of SAS Macro Series, we were discussing about Proc SQL into clause where we were able to create macro variables. Today we will be talking about how to create macro variables in datastep using CALL SYMPUT or CALL Symputx, and also I will very briefly compare how to create macro variables by Proc SQL into clause and also CALL SYMPUT, especially to show you which one is easier, not to contrast something but to show how easy one is above other. Now let us quickly look into what are the topics we are going to cover. The topics I'm going to cover today is what is CALL SYMPUT and what is CALL Symputx, and what are the differences between both of these, and what are the advantages of CALL Symputx. And also we will briefly look into the comparison of Proc SQL into clause with CALL Symputx. Now let us go into brief introduction. This is the introduction which is pretty much close to what I have discussed with Proc SQL into clause. Both Proc SQL into clause and CALL Symputx helps us to create macro variables from data. But CALL SYMPUT and CALL Symputx help us to create macro variables in datastep, and both of them helps us to avoid hard coding, and these are great tools to handle metadata. By using dictionary.tables and macro variables, we can have n number of applications. Now let us quickly look into CALL Symputx. In here I am using a data step. In here, as I do not have any data or I do not want to create any data, I am saying data underscore null underscore, and in here I am having a variable var and I am giving its value as hello world. In here I am using CALL SYMPUT to create macro variable. For CALL SYMPUT, the first argument which I am giving in here, which is in quotes, is macro variable. Second argument is my variable, both are separated by comma, and in here it need not be the variable, but it could be directly the character value in here. That is, I can just use hello world in here, and I can create my macro variable which has the value of hello world. But in this case we are using var as my second argument, which is nothing more than my variable. And CALL Symputx is also pretty similar. We have two arguments. The first argument is nothing more than my macro variable name, and the second is my variable name, and this macro variable will have the value of var. And I am putting both of these values into the log by using pipe in front and back of my macro variable. In here I am doing both for ampersand macvar and ampersand macvar1, and both the values resolves to hello world. This is to show that we are able to capture the value of variable, and we were able to take that value into a macro variable. So this is one important thing to remember. By using datastep CALL SYMPUT and CALL Symputx, we were able to capture the value of variable into a macro variable. Now we have looked into a character variable. Now. Now let us look into a numeric variable in here. In here everything is same, but my variable value is a numeric value, and I am doing a CALL SYMPUT and CALL Symputx, wherein I am saying nmacvar and then putting that into quotes, comma var, and for CALL Symputx I am saying nmacvar1 quotes comma var. Again this var value is captured into the macro variable. Same is the case with CALL Symputx. And I am having a pipe as previously what I have shown you for both of these call symput and call symputx macro variables, that is ampersand nmacvar and ampersand nmacvar1. Here I want you to focus little bit more. For call symput, you can see there is a left space, whereas in the case of call symputx, there is no left space. So call symputx, what it does is, whenever we have a numeric value, it does not keep the left space, it removes the left space, whereas in the case of call symput, it does not remove the left space. If you look, or if you remember from what we have done in the proc SQL into clause, in the proc SQL into clause also, whenever we were taking a numeric value into a macro variable, we were having left space and we used trimmed there. So proc SQL into clause plus trimmed is what is called Symputx. So call Symputx you can use in the data step, and you can take a number, and it also creates a macro variable and removes the left spaces. Now let us quickly look into what are the differences between call Symputx and also call symput. One of the major differences what we have seen was call symput, whenever we create a macro variable from a numeric variable, we have left space. For call symputx, we do not have left space. Another difference is whenever we use a numeric variable and we create a macro variable, as I am showing with the call symput here, we will have a note in the log saying numeric values have been converted to character values at the place given by line and column. Whereas with the call Symputx, we do not see those kind of note. So with these two aspects, the call Symputx looks little bit more comfortable to use. Now let us look into another aspect or another difference between call symput and call Symputx. Before going into those details, I need to discuss one important point. That is, whenever we create macro variables in a macro, usually they are local macro variables that are created. Local macro variables means macro variables are just related to that particular macro, but they are not available outside of the macro. But when we create macro variables outside of the macro, they are usually known as global macro variables, are available for macro and for any other programs to use. I need to tell one important point here. This is a gross generalization, I am doing it. More on this topic we will learn when we talk or when we discuss about scope of the macro variables. And again, calls input is little bit more complicated when we talk about their scope, especially when we are creating them in a macro. For now, let's just focus on what are the differences between call symput and call symputx in the context of options they provide. Here I have a macro. In the macro I am saying macro test and I am saying var equal to. My parameter is var and then I am saying equal to. And then I am saying data underscore null underscore, and I am using my call symput and I am creating my macro variable m underscore macvar and ampersand var. Means whatever the value of ampersand var will be the value for this new macro variable m underscore macvar. And call symputx, if you see here, I am having a third option. As I said to you, whenever we create macro variables in a macro, they are usually local macro variables, but call symputx gives me another option, that is G in here, to create a global macro variable. Again, This topic is much more complicated than what I'm saying, but what I want you to focus on in here is call Symputx can take three arguments, whereas call Symputx takes two only. And after my data step is completed, after run, I'm doing %put underscore user underscore. And after %man, once I compile this macro and execute this macro, here I am passing the value of hello. In this macro, we have asked to do %put underscore user underscore. That is, we want to see all the user defined macro variables. And that is what we see in the log in here. We see many more macro variables, but I have not shown you that for simplicity. But I want you to focus on these three macro variables and their scope. Whenever we have a result like this, the first one is scope, second one is the macro variable name, third one is its value. Here, my macro variable scope is test, means the macro variable m underscore macvar just belongs to this macro and its value is hello. Same is the case with the var, its value is hello in quotes and it just belongs to this test macro, which means both of these are local macro variables, whereas m underscore macvar1 is a global macro variable. As I have given an option of G in here for call Symputx, so it has become a global macro variable, and m underscore macvar again has a value of hello. The important point to remember here is call Symputx gives an additional option to define the scope. It is not that we can only define G, we can also define L, that is local, but again all of this we will discuss in future sessions. Now let's move further ahead. Till now we have been taking one value and we have been putting into a macro variable. Now let us see how we can make multiple macro variables using call symput. And in here what I want to do is I want to take all the values in a particular variable. In here I have SAS help.class and I have the variable name as name and it has 19 values. I want to make macro variable for each value. Now let us see how we can make this possible. In here I'm using call Symputx, but I have not shown you something before is using a data set in here. So I'm starting with data underscore null underscore followed by a set statement wherein I'm saying set SAS help.class semicolon and then I'm using call Symputx. And in here I have two arguments. The first argument is cat, which is CATT, followed by parenthesis nm comma underscore n underscore parenthesis closed. This whole is one argument and this argument contains my macro variable name and the second one is my variable name. So let us look little bit deeper into this argument wherein I am giving more of a SAS expression wherein I am trying to concatenate nm with underscore n underscore. Underscore n underscore represents the number of times data step has iterated and it starts with 1. I have made a video on this topic and link for the same I will give in the description below. As I said, it starts with 1. So when in the first iteration, we will have the value as Alfred, that is name will have the value of Alfred, and this becomes nm1 because we are concatenating both of this. Now our macro variable name will be nm1 and it will have the value of Alfred. When it goes into the second iteration, that is when it reaches the second observation, what will happen is this becomes nm2 and the name will be Alice. And in the same fashion, this underscore and underscore will become 3 and we will be reading Barbara. So our new macro variable will be nm3 and it will have the value of Barbara. In the same fashion, as we have 19 observations, what will happen is it will create 19 macro variables and underscore and underscore will increase by 1 after each observation and the name value will also change. In this fashion, what will happen is we are creating 19 macro variables with nm1, nm2, nm3, nm4, nm5, nm6 till nm19. So in this way, we can create multiple macro variables in call Symputx. So to do that, here what we are doing is we are using underscore and concatenating with a string to create multiple macro variables. Now let us see how we can reference these multiple macro variables. And I have made a very detailed video on this topic, how to access multiple macro variables. The concept is absolutely same. The only difference is the way we create macro variables, which I am showing you in here from data underscore null and run, and the do loop wherein we are going to access all the macro variables is exactly same as what I have discussed in Proc SQL into class, and link for the same I will give in the description below. Now to go into the details, here I am creating a macro and I am calling its name as mini macvars, and in here I have datastep wherein I will be creating many macro variables as shown in here and we have discussed in detail in the previous slide. Apart from that, we are also creating another macro variable CNT, and in here I am saying call Symputx CNT comma n. Now let us try to understand what this n is and what its value is. So after our set statement, we are also saying n ops equal to n. What this n ops equal to n does is it will create a temporary variable n and it will have the value of number of observations in SAS help class. Again, NOPS is a little bit complicated topic. It is not as straightforward as what I'm trying to say. But for now, for this topic, this is good enough. What we are doing is we are capturing the value of number of observations and putting it into a temporary variable n, and now the macro variable cnt what we are creating in here will have the value of 19 because n is 19. And now we are looping through this. How are we doing it? We are doing percent to I equal to 1 percent to ampersand cnt semicolon. As I said to you, ampersand CNT is nothing more than 19. So now our loop starting point is 1 and ending point is 19. And by using percent put statement, we are going to access these macro variables by writing ampersand nm ampersand I. And this kind of reference in which we do multiple ampersands is known as indirect reference. And I have made a video on this topic also, and link for the same I will give in the description below. And in here what happens is wherein we have ampersand nm ampersand I, 2 ampersand will become 1 ampersand in the first pass, ampersand I will become 1 in the first iteration. So now we are accessing ampersand nm1 and its value is Alfred. That is what we see in the log. When I moves to 2 in the second iteration, this ampersand name ampersand I becomes ampersand nm2 and it resolves to Alice. In the same fashion, till 19, we will be creating macro variables starting from ampersand nm1 to ampersand nm19, and we can access the macro variable values by doing so. Here in the result you can see that we are having the values of Alfred, Alice, Barbara, Carol to William just by having this ampersand ampersand nm ampersand I. Now, please also check out my another video of Proc SQL into clause. I go little bit more deeper on this aspect in that particular video, and I do not want to again repeat myself. Now, let us try to compare call Symputx with Proc SQL into clause. Functionally, they are both same. What we are trying to compare here is ease of use, in which we can easily get the results we want. Now let's try with call Symputx. And in here I'm trying to show something different than what I have shown you previously. In here we have call Symputx and we are creating a macro variable yr. For second argument, what I am doing is I am using today function. Today function gives the information related to current date. On top of it, I am using an year function. An year function pulls year from any date which we provide. As we have provided today's date, the year function, what it will do is it will pull the current year, and this current year value will be taken by our macro variable, which means our macro variable will have the value of 2022. And if we do a percent put ampersand yr, here you can see that the value is 2022. Now, before going into proc SQL into clause, I would like to say one more word. So, the second argument need not be just a string, number, or a variable. It could be any SAS expression which resolves into a result, and this result can be picked up by this macro variable. And to do the same in proc SQL into clause, we need to write proc SQL no print, and then we need to say select distinct, and then we need to apply our two functions in here and then do into and then colon our macro variable name from SAS help.class or any data set here. So the main problem in here is proc SQL does not allow us any query to be valid without having a from clause. So what will happen if we do like this, it is going to read all the records from SAS help.class even though we are not using anything from it. So what looks like a pretty simple thing in call Symputx looks unusual and complicated in proc SQL into clause, because we are using a distinct here and also we are using some data set which has no relevance with this one. So whenever we have to use a single value without a table, call Symputx is best. Something like the year and today functions which we have been using, and to create a macro variable, always go for call Symputx. Now let us look into the next comparison. Concatenating all the variable values into a single macro variable. Now let us try to understand this by looking into SAS help.class dataset. What here we want to do is we want to take the name variable and we want to concatenate all of these values into one macro variable. And let's see how we can do this by using proc SQL into clause. With proc SQL into clause, all I need to do is I need to say select name into colon macro variable name separated by a delimiter. Here the delimiter is space from SAS help.class. What this does is it concatenates all the variable values, if you can see in here, and what it again does is it puts all the concatenated values into a single macro variable, and in here we are calling that macro variable name as all names. And when I do percent put ampersand all names, you can see that this macro variable has all the values of variable but in a concatenated form. Now to do the same thing in datastep and to use call symput or call symputx, it becomes little bit more complicated. In here, it is not as automatic as in here where I am just saying separated by a delimiter, everything gets concatenated in the back end and then we get our macro variable with all those values in it. Here, we need to provide a logic, and that logic in the data step concatenates all the values. Once that concatenated value we get, then we can do a call symput or call symputx to get that value into our macro variable. From length statement to end, we have that logic wherein we concatenate all the values and put it into a variable, and this variable which we have created and which has all the concatenated values is then used in call symput. Now if you see here, this is lot of logic, but whereas in the case of into clause, this is way simpler. So whenever we want to concatenate variable values into single macro variable, I would always prefer proc SQL into clause. And now let's look into another aspect. That is how we can use or apply these macro variables which we have created in call symput or call symputx. And we can do this application by three different ways. The first one is by simply using dataset values and creating macro variables out of it and then solving some problem. Or we can use dictionary.tables or related tables. And when it comes to data step, that is where we are creating our macro variables for call Symputx. These tables are known as SAS help v tables. And the third application is by doing control tables. I have made a very detailed video on this topic in Proc SQL into clause, and link for the same I will give in the description below. Even though we can create macro variables by call symput or by Proc SQL into clause, the way we use them is same. And basically we use in one of these three styles and we solve some general problems. Now it's time to wrap up the whole topic. When compared between call Symputx and call Symputx removes left space when we try to make numeric value as macro variable, whereas call Symputx does not do that. Call Symputx also can take more options to make a macro variable global or local. And also, call Symputx does not throw a note when we are using a numeric value and converting into a macro variable, but call symput does gives us the note. And also when comparing call symput or call symputx with proc SQL into clause, call symput is good to handle single value into single macro variable than proc SQL into. Concatenating variable values into a single macro variable is easy to handle in the case of proc SQL into clause rather than by doing it with call symput or call symputx. That's all for this topic. If you like this topic, please give it a thumbs up, share and subscribe. Thank you.